All right, Chapter 39, the respiratory system. When unicellular organisms first formed in the ocean water carried nutrients, oxygen, and the cells just got those materials across their cell membranes. So the ocean water itself was the blood of this system. And the way the oxygen got into the ocean water would be at the surface of the ocean where it interfaced with the air. There's a much higher concentration of oxygen in air, especially when the Earth, as the Earth progressed, there was an increase in oxygen. You remember sometime around the Ediacaran time before the Cambrian explosion. And so the interface between the oxygen, or the air and the ocean, that would have been the respiratory surface, in a sense. And then the oxygen would diffuse through the water and would transport by diffusion into the individual cells. You need to recall that oxygen as a gas is O double bond O. And so it is nonpolar, so it can go directly through a plasma membrane. It does not need a channel protein or a carrier protein. Also, C double bond O, C double bond O. This is a linear molecule as well. These are both linear. They don't have an angle. It's a 180-degree angle, I guess you could say. And it's also nonpolar for that reason. So both of these molecules can go across the membrane, cell membrane, with no channel protein or pore protein. So its diffusion is sufficient. So once the organisms became multicellular, still when they're very small, still the ocean water is touching all the cells directly. But as the bodies got larger, there were some cells on the interior of the body that would not be close enough to the surface to be able to get sufficient amount of oxygen or nutrients. And so the evolution of the internal circulation, basically bringing the ocean water to the inside of the body, was necessary. And when organisms live in the ocean, then they still use the ocean water to get their oxygen. However, on land, there has to be an additional system to bring the oxygen in, and then the oxygen will interface with the circulatory fluid inside the body. So that's conceptually how the respiratory system for land animals developed, or why it developed more so. So in the ocean, here you have an alga. This is Ventricaria ventricosa, which is huge, 1 to 5 centimeters for just one cell. So it's like a huge, for a cell, that's enormous. But diffusion is good enough for this guy, but it's only one cell. When organisms get larger, like a flatworm, remember the flatworm, especially the ones that live in the ocean, even the ones that live on land have to stay wet. The ocean water will touch the surface cells, and you'll remember that he has a mouth, and there's a cavity on the inside called the gastrovascular cavity. The ocean water can go in there and touch the cells on the inside. So still diffusion is sufficient when the bodies are not very thick. Once the animals got much larger, let's say fish, we'll start here. I'm skipping quite a few things, but let's go look at fish. This is the pharyngeal slit. Behind it, this red tissue, are the gills. The gills are actually really well adapted to getting oxygen out of the water. And this picture is backwards. In the latest version of this, they updated it and they made the arrows go the other way, which is something everybody noticed when they first put out this book. Okay, so the water actually goes this direction. The water would flow this direction across the gills in this picture. That would be correct. And the blood always goes from oxygen pores. It's going through the gills. It picks up the oxygen. The blood is going in this direction. So water flow sort of left to right, blood flow right to left. And that's happening in the gills so that the maximum amount of oxygen can be picked up. Water doesn't carry a ton of oxygen, so there are adaptations to kind of maximize how much oxygen can be picked up. So the countercurrent flow of the blood through the gills is really a really good solution to this problem. The gills are right here, you'll remember, so right under that gill slit. A lot of fish have to keep their mouth open to let the water flow out through their mouth and then out that slit. But as the water flows across, the blood is flowing the other direction. And that maximizes the amount of oxygen that can be picked up. On land, it gets even trickier. On land, you have to have some way of getting the gas to interface with the blood or the circulatory fluid. Arthropods have what's called an open circulation, but they still have a fluid. The fluid has an oxygen carrying protein in it. And so they have little holes all over their body, particularly the land hexapods have little holes all over their body. And if you travel down any one of those little holes, it perforates in. So the gas can move through this tracheal system. It's like a system of tubes. And then it does interact with the fluid that's swooshing around inside the body. It's an open circulation. And that allows some interface with the fluid of the body so that the oxygen can diffuse into that fluid. So the tracheal system with these little spiracles is the structure we see in insects. That's why if you pinch the mouth of an insect closed, you will not suffocate him, because he eats through his mouth, but he breathes through these little holes all over his body. So the only way to suffocate him, one way, is to cover him in oil. And that will clog up all these little holes and prevent him from being able to take in any oxygen. Okay, so pretty quickly though, we're going to focus on the human respiratory system. So we're going to bring the oxygen into the body, and it's going to interface, it's going to come into close contact with the blood, which is the internal ocean, and by diffusion it will move from the lungs into the blood. So the parts, the anatomy of it, we're going to do anatomy and physiology. Anatomy are just the parts. So you have the pharynx. The pharynx has several parts. The part behind the nose is called nasopharynx. The part behind the mouth is called oropharynx. The part that they're pointing to here is more like laryngopharynx, I think is what it's called. But pharynx is this space. So oxygen comes into the pharynx, and there is an opening to the trachea here, and it's called the glottis. So the opening is called the glottis. And then there's this little flap here that's called the epiglottis. So when you're eating food, the flap will cover the glottis so that the food will go down the backside, which is the esophagus. But when you're breathing, the air goes through the glottis, through the larynx, which is sometimes called voice box. And that's kind of a protruding thing in your neck, sometimes called the Adam's apple. And then down into the trachea. The trachea has these rings of cartilage, so it's very easily identifiable. And then the trachea splits, we say bifurcates, into left and right. And remember, left and right refers to the person in the picture, not your left and right, but their left and right. So this would be left and this would be right. because that would be their left and right. So you have the left bronchus and the right bronchus. So that's the next main tube after trachea, bronchus. Then it splits into a secondary and a tertiary bronchus. They get smaller and smaller, like tree branches. And then the smallest branch is called the bronchiole. At the end of the bronchiole, which we call the terminal bronchiole, then there are these alveoli, and alveoli is spelled like this. Alveoli, that's plural, and that it's not pronounced alveoli, it's alveoli. So you may want to say that out loud. So the alveoli are these soft tissue, almost like bubbles of tissue, and on the outer surface there are capillaries. And so these little compartments fill with oxygen or air, and then the oxygen will diffuse across this very soft membrane into the capillaries. So I have put a video for you to watch. I've linked this up in eCampus so you can watch. Really what you're watching is the glottis, where the vocal cords are, and it's kind of opening and closing, and then occasionally you'll see the epiglottis flip over when they swallow some spit, because when you talk occasionally you have to swallow some spit. So occasionally you'll see when they take kind of a breath, sometimes you'll see the epiglottis flip forward briefly as they swallow something. So it's really interesting to watch. But they put a camera through their nose. It goes into their nasopharynx, down, all the way down, until it's hanging right above the glottis. So it's a really interesting video. But we're going to continue to lungs. So lungs are packed with millions of these alveoli, which is this thin, bubbly tissue. And by having so many of these, it gives you tons and tons of surface area. Surface area is really important for maximizing absorption. We saw a huge amount of surface area in the digestive tract that is created by the villi and the microvilli. The same concept is working here. By having lots of surface area, you can maximize your oxygen absorption, your oxygen diffusion. All right, so really the inhaled air passes through really glottis first, then larynx, then trachea, if I was putting them in order. The trachea bifurcates, that means splits into two. You have left and right bronchi. They continue to subdivide, subdivide, subdivide until you get to the bronchioles. And at the end of the bronchioles, you have that soft tissue, that bubbly tissue that's called the alveoli. Interestingly, the left lung, here's the trachea here. The left lung, which would be this one for this guy, the left lung is smaller than the right lung because the heart is more on the left side, a little bit more. And so there's a little bit of space that's a little less space on this side. But the left lung has 2 lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes. And then the diaphragm is immediately under and really connected to the lungs. And then under here, this picture is, oh, this is what they're showing as the diaphragm. Okay, I see now. And then underneath the diaphragm would be the liver. So on the outer surface of the alveoli are all of these capillaries. So as the air comes into this space, it's able to go across the moist tissue into the capillaries. The cells of the trachea and the bronchi and the bronchioles have cilia. And the cilia help to move particles through. Excuse me. All right, let's talk about how this whole system works. So when you breathe in oxygen, oxygen from the ambient air, from the environment, it depends on where you are. If you're close to sea level, it's going to be different than if you're up high on a mountain. But let's say we're going to just pick kind of a typical number, all right, 160 millimeters of mercury and 0.2 millimeters of mercury. This is how we measure pressure, barometric pressure. So partial pressure means how much of the air pressure is from this one gas. So ambient air has a lot more oxygen than CO2. Now, by the way, there's other gases in here. They're not showing those. But anyway, so of the CO2 and oxygen levels, let's say you start with these numbers. So when you bring this in, it goes down the trachea, goes into one lung or the other, and eventually it's going to get to that alveoli, or that alveolus, and it will diffuse across. Now, it only diffuses across if the concentration of oxygen in the blood is less than 160. But typically, the concentration of what is coming from the body is called deoxygenated blood. So this would be venous blood, blood in the veins. So this is typically going to have, when the blood comes back to your heart, when it comes back to your lungs, I should say, from the body, it only has about 40 millimeters of mercury. So in the air, it's 160. When it's coming back to the lung, it has about 40. So it's going to move then from the alveoli into those capillaries. And then that blood now becomes oxygenated. It doesn't go fully to 160, though. It only gets up to about 100. So as the diffusion goes from the ambient air, which is 160, it goes into the blood, which itself only has 40. It kind of meets at an isotonic part, I guess, point, you could say, at 100. And so the blood going from the lungs to the rest of the body has about 100. But when it goes out to the body, it gets to the tissues, and the tissues have less than 100. So the oxygen moves out by diffusion. So we'll say these are the tissues down here. And it goes from being 100 to being 40 again. So then it goes back to the lungs and becomes 100 again, and then comes back to the tissues, drops off that oxygen, and becomes 40. So that just keeps going that way. Now, what if you're in an area where there's not this much oxygen? What if you were in an area, what if you were really high up on a mountain and the concentration was 100 of oxygen was 100 millimeters of mercury? You could move your diaphragm up and down, but if it's 100 in the ambient air and 40 in your body, then you're going to get less coming in. So it'll meet it in the middle, probably about 65 or something. What if you're on a mountain even higher up and it's only 40 millimeters of mercury? You won't bring in any oxygen. I don't care how much you expand and contract your lungs. Diffusion won't allow, because it's 40 here and 40 here, there won't be any intake of oxygen. So really the whole system relies on the concept that there has to be a higher concentration of oxygen in the air than what's in your blood. And then there has to be more in your blood than what's in your tissues, so that each of these transfers can happen. Now, why do your tissues not eventually get 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen? Well, it's because your cells are using the oxygen for cellular respiration. And so as soon as that oxygen goes into the tissue, it gets turned into water. And so there's a constant need for more oxygen. It never builds up in the tissues. The only time that you would actually have an equal amount of oxygen in your tissues as in your blood would be if you're dead or if the tissue is dead, because then there's no cellular respiration, which means you can keep pumping the blood through, but it won't have a gradient necessary to move the oxygen into the tissues. So it completely runs according to the rules of diffusion. All right, let's talk a little bit more about lung structure. The lung is covered by what's called the visceral pleural membrane. That's the outside of the lung. The inner wall of the body cavity is lined by what's called the parietal pleural membrane. And those two touch. There's a very thin space between them, full of fluid, but they adhere together there. And so your lung is attached to your body wall. They're also attached to the diaphragm. Oh, this looks weird. Why did this do this? Let's see. If I can fix that. Okay. So it's really small here, but here's your visceral pleura. Oops. Here's your parietal pleura, and then there's a tiny space in between. Here's your diaphragm down here. All right. So those are your structures there. All right, when you inhale, you have two things that happen. So this is really more physiology, the actual function of this. There's two contractions that happen. The intercostal muscles of the ribs, intercostal muscles go between the ribs, and that expands the rib cage. And the contraction of the diaphragm means it pulls downward. So the rib cage moves outward, the diaphragm moves downward, and that creates negative pressure or vacuum inside the lungs, which draws air in. So this is the way it works. So here's a picture. It's actually pretty decent. I actually think this one's better than the actual lung. The lung picture's okay, but you really got to look back and forth. You know, A is when you're inhaling, B is when you're exhaling. And when you inhale, it creates the pulling down of the diaphragm and the pulling out of the intercostal muscles of the rib cage. Increase the volume of the lungs so it forces the air in. I know you don't feel like that's what you're doing, but it is. Yeah, you might be able to tell that is what you're doing. Then when you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, it goes back up. The intercostal muscles relax, they go back in, and that creates pressure to force the air out. So that's how it works. All right, now there is a certain amount of elasticity in your lungs, but there is a maximum point where if you do too much, you can cause damage in lungs. Like if you put somebody on a ventilator and put too much air in with each, inhalation, so to speak, you could rupture the lungs for sure. All right. But when you inhale, it creates the stretch, and then you just kind of release the muscle contractions, and it just kind of springs back into the exhale. I don't know why it did this when I changed the format on this. It got all a little weird. Let me see if I can find. I think I'll just take a break and I can find a better picture like this.